Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a big step back and moving far beyond the typical partisan shouting matches you've probably heard 1,000 times before. Instead, we're going to use the source material we have today to dissect the deeper philosophical and institutional mechanics of the pandemic mandate divide. This isn't about surface-level politics, it's about the structural foundations of how our society reacted during a global crisis and what that actually reveals about us. Because the truth is, the institutions altered by this divide are the exact same ones you and I rely on every single day.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the source material drops a really fascinating twist right out of the gate. We all know the pandemic was heavily political, but this analysis argues it wasn't just your standard partisanship. It was a regime selection event, meaning it acted as a massive societal filter, essentially sorting people entirely by their willingness to comply with authority.
Let's look at how that happened in Part 1, the 4 mandate questions.
Now, I want to deliberately slow down here so we can really absorb the weight of this first question. Will you accept an official narrative when the legal, medical, and ethical details are unsettled? This gets right to the core of human behavior during a crisis. It asks how much uncertainty we can tolerate and at what point we simply defer to an institutional voice for a sense of safety, even if the facts on the ground are still actively shifting.
Then we hit an even more profound premise. Will you subordinate bodily autonomy to institutional command? Just think about that for a second. It asks us to examine the exact threshold where personal sovereignty, the absolute control over your own physical body, is simply handed over to an institutional directive. Next up, will you treat dissent as a public health problem, a civil rights problem, or a loyalty problem? Notice the deeply contrasting ways society categorized disagreement here. If you view dissent as a public health problem, your solution is quarantine or removal. If you view it as a civil rights problem, your solution is legal protection. But if you view it as a loyalty problem, your solution is ostracization. The category you chose completely dictated your moral response to your neighbors.
And finally, will you tolerate coercion when it is applied to the socially disfavored? When you take them all together, these aren't just your standard policy debates. They're almost like an ideological sorting hat. They reveal that the traditional left versus right divide actually became a proxy for a massive collision between two very different moral grammars.
Which brings us to Part 2, the grammar of the left.
To really grasp this, look at how the unvaccinated were viewed by institutions. The author points out that they weren't seen as asserting informed consent, they were seen as refusing solidarity. The left relied so heavily on a grammar of collective responsibility, expertise, and social compliance that the very concept of a bodily violation just disappeared. It was entirely swallowed up inside a broader, seemingly unassailable narrative about protecting others. If the focus is solely on the collective, the individual's claim to informed consent simply ceases to register in that moral vocabulary.
Now, shifting gears, let's look at Part 3, the slogans of the right.
And this brilliantly illustrates what was happening on the other side. The source material is equally critical here, noting that while conservatives instinctively felt a violation was occurring, they completely failed to do the deep, rigorous analytical work required to actually challenge it. Instead of dissecting complex institutional machinery, like the massive legal difference between a temporary emergency use authorization and a fully vetted biologics license application, much of the right just relied on underdeveloped slogans. Yelling about freedom and overreach might be politically useful, but it fundamentally failed to provide a sociological or constitutional indictment of what was actually happening within the institutions.
So we're basically left with two massive blind spots. On one side, you have a grammar of solidarity that effectively obscured a bodily violation. On the other, you have broad rhetorical slogans that lack structural teeth. Both political poles ultimately fail to confront the true architectural shift happening within our institutions.
And that leads us right into Part 4, the orphaned issue.
Because both sides failed to fully map out the reality of the situation, this profound societal injury has been left entirely politically homeless. This brings us to a highly uncomfortable conclusion from the source text. The pandemic response became a loyalty test disguised as public health, and the mandate regime changed the composition of institutions by selecting for compliance under coercive ambiguity. According to the author, this claim that we systematically weeded out non-compliant individuals from our military, medical, and federal workforces is simply too implicating for most people on either side of the political aisle to handle.
So, why exactly is this topic avoided so much? Well, For the left to embrace this analysis, they'd have to admit that concepts like compassion and public health were actively used to justify exclusion, coercion, and bodily domination. That is morally explosive. For the right to embrace it, they would have to stop harvesting surface-level outrage, do the really unglamorous technical work of institutional reform, and admit that many Republican-aligned institutions, employers, and courts completely folded under the pressure. It's too technically demanding for one side and too morally devastating for the other.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that the true divide exposed by the pandemic wasn't Republican versus Democrat. The real fracture line was between institutional compliance and embodied conscience. That is the fundamental axis upon which the public was sorted.
The author actually synthesizes this perfectly, saying, the left largely refused to see the violation because the victims had been coded as threats. The right often saw the violation but lacked the discipline, vocabulary, or incentive to explain the machinery. These dual ideological blind spots virtually guarantee that our deepest institutional injuries remain completely unaddressed.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question. Where does an orphaned issue go next? When neither side of the political binary has the vocabulary, the tools, or the desire to fully resolve a fracture of this magnitude, what is the long-term aftermath for the institutions we all rely on every single day? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will leave you to ponder that.